The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
And I do have an Irish tale. It's in Irish lore, the land of Tir na Nog is a mythical island said to be located off the west coast of Ireland. It's a paradise. The climate is perfect. There's no sickness or death, just happiness and beauty. And because time stands still there, people do not grow old. So the only way to get there, though, there's a way, is by magic. Not everyone can go there, even though it's so desirable. And this story is about a warrior named Oisín and what happened when he went to Tir na Nog. Oisín was a great warrior. He was a fine athlete and a gifted poet. He was the son of the great Finn McCool, the leader of the Fianna, which was the group of strong, talented men who guarded the King of Ireland. And every day, Oisín and his fellow Fianna warriors would ride their horses around the green hills of Ireland, hunting and exploring every day. And one sunny morning, it was Oisín who was leading the hunt, and he had his father's dog with him, his father's dog, Bran. And no sooner had they entered the forest when they saw a beautiful stag grazing, and the stag looked up, saw them, and ran, of course, leading them on a chase around Loch Lean and beyond, into the hills beyond the lake. And Oisín was proud of the way that Bran was gaining on the stag until they came to a wide river. And with one mighty leap, the stag cleared that river. And Bran, even though he was a strong dog, could not jump like that. He went in the river and tried to swim, but it was too late. The stag was long gone, so Bran came back, hanging his head, and Oisín just pet him gently and said, "It's all right, Bran, it's all right." And suddenly Bran bristled and stiffened and began to bark wildly. And Oisín turned to see what was happening, and behind him, there in the distance, he saw a white steed, its mane flowing, approaching them from the top of a hill. And he couldn't make out who the rider was, but he was fascinated by the way that steed just seemed to float over that rough terrain. And in the next instant, Oisín was looking at a vision that took his breath away. There, astride that magnificent steed, was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She had long golden hair that flowed around her face, and she wore a pale blue dress covered with stars. And on her head was a delicate crown studded with jewels and diamonds, and that just sparkled in the morning sun. And he looked at her, and when he got his voice, he said, Who are you? Where did you come from? And how can I be of assistance? I am Niamh from the land of Tir na Nog, where my father is king. She spoke in the sweetest of tones. And Oisín, I have searched for you for a long time, for your fame as a great warrior and poet has spread to faraway places. And then she told him of Tir na Nog, where people never grow old, where there's no sickness or death, no strife or discontent. People live in peace and harmony. In Tir na Nog, the sun shines every single day. And she continued, I want to take you back to this magical land with me. For you see, my parents have wanted me to marry several times, but I've refused. Oisín, I want to marry only you. And if you come with me to that magical land of Tir na Nog, I promise you, you will have my love forever. Her voice was like music, to his ears. And now Oisin had never thought he would ever leave Ireland. He loved Ireland. He loved his father and his brother warriors. But he was so drawn to Tir na Nog and to Niamh, her promise of love and the land of eternal youth, that he bid his father and his friends farewell, and he leapt on that steed behind Niamh, and the horse turned and galloped faster than the wind, faster and faster over vast expanses of ocean, as if they were on dry land, over snow-covered islands and fiery mountains. The landscape just flashed before his eyes, faster and faster, until they came to a large forest, and then the horse slowed its pace. And then it stopped in front of a gatehouse. And 2 guards opened the iron gates, and immediately there was a fanfare of trumpets announcing their arrival. And 2 rows of people lining a walkway that led up to the palace where the king and queen stood. And within a few days, wedding preparations were made, and Oisin and Niamh were joined in marriage. Now, Oisin was deeply in love with Niamh, and he was happy there. He had everything that he ever needed or wanted. He loved just strolling around on those hills, overlooking the forest that surrounded the palace. And one day, as he sat there on a rock taking in all the beauty around him, he thought he heard the sound of a bugle from the Fianna, summoning the warriors to hunt. He half expected to see his father's dog Bran appear over the horizon, but that didn't happen. He knew it was just his imagination, but he was suddenly seized with just an overpowering longing to go back to Ireland, to see his father and his friends. And when Niamh discovered that that's what was bothering him, she said, "Oisin, this is the moment I feared the most since we were married. But I will not stop you from visiting Ireland. I just need you to make a solemn promise that you will not dismount from my steed, which I will give you to take you there. Because if your feet even touch Irish soil, you can never return here to Tir na Nog. We will never see each other again." Well, Oisin knew he couldn't live with that, so of course he promised. And early the next morning, he bid Niamh farewell, and he leapt on that steed, and the steed turned and galloped toward Ireland, and they were there faster with the speed of wind, and they arrived there in Ireland, and Oisin went to the lakes of Colonie, where he expected to hear the sound of bugles and the baying of dogs, but all was quiet. And not only that, the whole landscape had changed. The forest where the Fianna used to love to hunt, all those trees were gone, chopped down and turned into pasture. Oisin saw one figure, a fisherman, casting his line off the shore of Lake Leon. And so he asked the fisherman, "Have you seen Finn McCool and the Fianna? Do you know where I can find them?" And the fisherman looked very puzzled. "Finn McCool and the Fianna," he repeated. "Why, they haven't hunted here since my great-grandfather was a boy." Oisin was puzzled. How could that be? He turned the horse and went to Kildare, which was the winter home of the Fianna. But all he found there were crumbling walls and covered with ivy and thorns and bushes. His eyes welled up with tears. He didn't know what was going on. And then he saw 3 men in the distance trying to roll a boulder, trying to push a boulder up toward a fence. And they saw him and they motioned for him to come and help. He went there, and with one hand he just reached down and just lifted that boulder and hurled it right to the fence. But the pressure of that move was so great that it broke the strap of his saddle, and he was hurled to the ground. And as soon as he touched Irish soil, he could feel the life being just draining out of him. And to the amazement of those three men, they saw that mighty warrior change to a withering old man right before their eyes. For you see, because time did not exist in Tir na Nog, Oisin thought it may have been about 3 years that had passed, when in fact it had been 300 years. And he lay on the ground, he turned his head, he saw the steed come, and the steed nudged his face gently, and then he turned and galloped toward Tir na Nog. But just before Oisin died that day, he was able to tell those three men the stories of Finn McCool and of the Fianna and of Tir na Nog. And those stories remain with us to this very day.
So this is a story that is about stories. There was once a woman who kept all of her stories and all of her songs to herself. Her memories, her dreams, all lay hidden deep inside because no one took the time to listen. But you know, those stories and those songs, they wanted to get out, and they found their way into the woman's dreams. And night after night, she would toss and turn and toss and turn until her husband leaned over and said, "What is the matter with you?" "I don't know," she said. "I simply do not know." Well, one morning her husband went off to work, and the poor woman was so tired that she lay right down on the kitchen floor and went sound asleep. Well, of course, when she did, her mouth opened wide and she began to snore. And the stories and the songs, well, they saw their chance to get out, and they flew right out of her mouth, and they hovered in the air above her. And then they looked down. "We can't just leave her there," said the stories. "Well, what are we going to do?" said the songs. And the stories changed themselves into a robe, and the songs became a pair of slippers. And the robe hung on a peg outside the bedroom door, and the slippers tucked themselves underneath. And then the woman's husband came home. And he saw the strange robe and slippers hanging by the door, and he looked at his wife and he said, "Is someone here?" She said, "No." "Well, then whose robe is that and whose slippers?" "I don't know," said the woman. "I simply don't know." Well, you can imagine that caused a bit of a row. And the husband and the wife began to argue, and they argued, and they argued, and they argued. Night fell. Now, in that village at that time, if a husband and a wife could not settle their argument by nightfall, the husband had to go sleep in the temple of the Monkey King. And so when night came, the husband stormed out of the house and made his way to the temple of the Monkey King. And he went inside and found a room and lay down on the floor to go to sleep. And the woman sat at the kitchen table, trying to figure out what had happened. And she thought, and she thought. Finally, she just gave up, blew out the candle, and put her head down on the table. Now, in that village at that time, when someone blew out a candle, the flame did not disappear. No, at night, all of the flames gathered in the temple of the Monkey King. Well, as the husband lay on the floor in the temple, he saw the tongues of flame come dancing in, one by one. And they hovered in the air, and it was obvious that they were growing impatient. They were nattering and chatting to each other. Well, where is he? He's never late. What do you think happened? I don't know, but he needs to get here right now. And now all of a sudden, the tardy flame came dancing in. Oh, you have to hear what happened at my house tonight. And all the other flames leaned in to hear what happened. Oh, my husband and my wife, oh, what a row they had. You see, when the husband came home, there was a strange robe and slippers hanging by the bedroom door. Oh, well, I bet that caused quite a bit of trouble. Oh, it did. But not for the reason that he thinks. He doesn't know. But that robe, it's all the stories that were in the woman's heart. And those slippers, they're all of the songs she has kept quiet. And when the husband heard that, he understood what had happened. And he got up out of the temple of the Monkey King, and in the moonlight walked back home. And when he entered the house, there was his wife, her head on the table, sound asleep. And he went to the peg by the door, and he picked up the robe, and he bent down and picked up the slippers. He carried that robe and gently placed it on his wife's shoulders. And when she woke up, he put the slippers on her feet. And then he sat down in a chair across from her at the kitchen table. And he looked at his wife. My dear wife, tell me your stories, sing me your songs, for I will not leave here until I have heard them all. And for days, oh, that house was filled with all kinds of sounds. There were howls of pain and peals of laughter and everything in between as the woman shared all of her stories and all of her songs. And that's a story called A Song Not Sung and a Tale Not Told, or something to that effect.
Here's a story of an orphan boy and a baseball player by the name of Gus Zernial, long time ago. The year was 1951. It was a beautiful, beautiful spring Saturday in Philadelphia, and the orphan boy was alone, as usual. In his 10 years in the orphanage, he had never had a friend, in quotes. That was the name given to a visitor coming to the orphanage. And that was no surprise, because even among his fellow orphans, he was an outcast. The other boys had reasons for that. For one thing, this boy was a bedwetter, and they made fun of him. They called him the wet the bed boy. And for another thing, he wasn't athletically inclined. And at recess, instead of joining in their games and their sports, he would find a corner in the playground and he would play marbles by himself. And for another thing, in the classroom, he was a pain, because he would raise his hand to answer every single question, wave it around to answer every question the teacher asked, and the others didn't like that. But the biggest source of contempt and scorn from the other boys was the very fact that he had never, not even once, had a friend visiting him. So imagine his surprise. One day he's called to the director's office, and he was told that there was a friend waiting for him, and he was astounded. Who could this friend be, and why would anyone, for that matter, want to visit me? But when he met his friend, whose name was Mr. Coleman, he saw a kind face and a warm smile. "How would you like to go to a ball game?" Mr. Coleman asked. "Okay," said the boy. Now, it turned out to be a baseball game, and the boy, of course, heard of baseball, but he never played it, and he didn't know anything about it. The game was played in the city at Shibe Park, and when the boy looked up, he saw a big sign that said, "Home of the Philadelphia A's." Oh, now he thought, that makes sense. They're probably orphans too. This is their home. And they're playing a team from Boston called the Red Sox. Well, Mr. Coleman led this boy up endless iron stairways until they came to the bleachers. And their seats were over there in a place known as left field. And when the boy stood there in front of his seat and looked out at that field, it was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. A vast, fan-shaped emerald green lawn. And from a place that Mr. Coleman told him was called home plate, there were two pure white lines diverging and then coming together again to create a perfectly formed diamond. And the whole field was surrounded by a tall green fence. And then once the field was watered and those pure white bases were set down, it was more beautiful, more perfect than anything he could ever imagine. And when Mr. Coleman saw that look of awe on the boy's face, he smiled. And then he cupped the boy's shoulders and he said, "Here come the players." And men in baggy flannel knickers came springing out onto the field, scattering all over. "Look, see him? See him?" Mr. Coleman was pointing to one of the players who was jogging across the field. And when the player stopped, he was almost right beneath them. And the boy looked down. He couldn't see much except the top of the hat and the shoulders and part of a large number on the player's back. "Who's he?" "He's Gus Zernial. He's the left fielder." But wait till he gets to bat. He can hit the ball a country mile. Why, he may even hit a home run today. A home run? Is that a good thing? Mr. Coleman didn't even answer that. He just closed his eyes and smiled and nodded so profoundly that the boy knew that a home run, whatever it was a very, very good thing. Well, Mr. Coleman explained every play of the game, and when a player slid into home plate, he nudged the boy and said, "Watch the umpire." And in an instant, the umpire would pull a whisk broom out of his hip pocket and squat down in that dust, and whoosh, 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 home plate reappeared as if by magic. And Mr. Coleman predicted everything that the boy would see. The arguing, the booing, the cheering, the spitting, and it was all true. And inning after inning, after the A's turn at bat, Gus Zernial would trot back and take his place at left field. And now it was the bottom of the 8th inning. Gus Zernial was at bat. And the boy was sitting there when suddenly a commotion erupted all around him. It seemed like everyone was cheering in unison, and then they all bolted to their feet, including Mr. Coleman. And the boy looked up and he saw it. A baseball, dove white, soaring through the air and falling at last into a sea of frantically straining arms several aisles away. No one had to tell him that that was a home run. And now he shaded his eyes and he watched as Gus Zernial touched each and every bag. And when he crossed home plate, all the players came out of the dugout to congratulate him. Oh, but he didn't tip his cap. Mr. Coleman told him that Gus Zernial would tip his cap if he made a home run, and he didn't. And Mr. Coleman promised, and all his other predictions came true. Why not this one? Now the boy was upset a little bit, but who was he to quibble over this one little detail? Because he was nothing but a wet-the-bed, wiseacre orphan boy with no real friends anyway. Why should Gus Zernial tip his cap for him? But he couldn't help longing for that tipped cap, even more so than for the home run itself. And he couldn't help wondering, was it because of me? He blinked back his tears, and now the inning ended, and Gus Zernial was trotting back to take his place in left field. And once again, the commotion started. the people began to shout and whistle and stamp their feet, and now they were chanting, "Gus, Gus, Gus." But he didn't even respond to that. He seemed to not hear them. He came back and he took his place and faced the infield, and behind the boy the chanting continued, and the boy wanted to chant. He wanted to call Gus, 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 but he was too afraid. What if Gus Zernial should see him? He might not like it. But then the chanting rose to a feverish pitch, and down below, Gus Zernial was turning around, and the boy could see that fancy letter A above the brim of his cap, and now he tilted his head back, and he was looking into the bleachers. He was looking right at me, the boy thought. And then with a delicacy one would never expect, Gus Zernial took the brim of that cap between his thumb and forefinger and briefly and forever tipped his cap.
This is an Patrick Riley. Patrick Riley was one of those people. He said and did things, and people were never 100% sure if those things that he said and did were wise or foolish. It really made them think. Well, there was this squire in Ireland who, he was very proud of who he was, very proud of his station in life, very satisfied with who he was, and he really wanted everybody to be aware of that. And so once a year, he had a grand party so that he could prove to everyone his generosity. And he sent out invitations far and wide, and on the day of the party, he sent out his servants to make sure that everyone was coming. Well, by the time those servants arrived at Patrick Riley's house, it was late in the afternoon, and Patrick was out in his garden digging up the potatoes. And the servants looked at him. "Patrick, what are you doing? Tonight's the squire's party. Get ready, man, and come to the party." "Oh, all right," said Patrick. And he put down the spade, went over to his house, kicked the dirt off his brogans, went inside, washed his hands, combed his hair, and started down the long road to the squire's house. And he walked, and he walked, and he walked. And when he arrived, there were two more servants standing at the front door, and they took one look at Patrick, and they said, "Patrick Riley, you can't come in here." "Why not?" "Look at you, man. You've got the dirt of the field still on your clothes. Go home and change." "All right." And Patrick turned around and made the long walk back to his house. Well, when he got there, he put on the only other set of clothes he had, a suit that he wore to weddings and funerals in the county fair. And then he pulled out his father's leather boots, the ones his father had given him when he died. And Patrick put on the boots. And then he turned around and walked out of the house and back down the road, the long, long way back to the squire's house. And when he arrived, those same two fellows were standing by the front door. And they took one look at him and they said, "Come right on in, Patrick Riley." Well, by the time Patrick got inside, the party was in full swing. There was one table lined up with the best of food. There were cakes and buns and sausages and kippers, everything that a person could want. And then there was another table, and there were spirits on that, you know, the kind that one drinks out of a glass very slowly or very quickly, depending on your preference. And tuning up in the corner were a couple of fiddlers and a gentleman about to play the concertina. And over in the other corner, well, there stood the squire, his arms arms crossed, a smile of satisfaction on his face as he surveyed all that was going on. Well, Patrick took a look around, and he went over to the table where the food was. He grabbed 2 sausages and put them in the pockets of his jacket. And then he went over to the kippers, and didn't he open up his suit coat and take 2 of those kippers and stuck them on the inside pocket? He took a piece of pie and he stuffed it in his pants pocket. He took a piece of cake and he stuck it in the other pocket. And then he began to stuff some bread up the sleeves. Everybody watched, and they all began to laugh because, of course, it was Patrick Riley. Everyone laughed except the squire, who raised his left eyebrow. Well, then Patrick made his way over to the table with the spirits, and he pulled off that long leather boot, and he set it right down in the center of the table, looked around, grabbed himself a bottle of Jameson's, uncorked it, and glug, 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 filled the boot. Everyone went, "Oh!" The color came into the squire's face. Well, then the fiddlers and the concertina fellow, they began to play, and everyone got out on the floor and began to dance, and Patrick walked right into the center, flipped off his jacket, held it over his hand, and said, "Excuse me, would you care to dance?" And Patrick went dancing around, holding his jacket, while everybody roared with laughter, except the squire. He got red in the face, and he marched right over to Patrick Riley. "Patrick Riley, what is the meaning of all this foolishness?" Well, the fiddlers and the concertina players stopped. Everyone else stopped, because, truth to be told, they really did want to know exactly what Patrick was up to. And Patrick looked at the squire. "Well," he said, "it's like this. The first time I came to your house, I was dressed in my everyday clothes, and the 2 fellows at the front door, they wouldn't let me in. So I went back home, and I changed my clothes. And when I returned, well, they opened the door wide and welcomed me. Well, since I was the same fellow both times, the only thing I can conclude is that you're not really interested in having me at the party. You're interested in my clothes. And so I'm just trying to accommodate your wishes and make sure that my clothes have the time of their life." And that's the story of Patrick Riley. And you can decide for yourself whether you think that's foolish or that's wise.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again,